Hi, welcome to my podcast Tunnat. This is actually, again, as you might have already guessed, an English episode, the second one, because today, Jamie and I, because Jamie is here as well again, we have the author Ken Liu from Boston. And I'm very excited. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Yvonne.
Woohoo! Yeah.
Hi, Jamie.
For the German audience who not everybody might know you already, maybe you could say some words to introduce yourself.
Oh, absolutely. So first of all, again, thank you, Yvonne, for inviting me. Thank you, Jamie. It's really cool to be here and talking with you and talking to a German audience. So most of my books are not translated into German. So I'll just say a little bit about my work. And for those of you who are curious, you can look them up. So my name is Ken Liu. I'm an American author of speculative fiction, is how I describe myself. What that means is I write across a range of genres, fantasy, science fiction, alternate history, even some realism, magic realism. Basically, all of my fiction is about the metaphorical nature of the universe and how we can make certain metaphors real in fiction, and then to make them literally true, and then to explore the world that comes once a metaphor has been made literally true. And we can talk more about that in detail once we get into the discussion of it. Primarily, so this is how, in the world that we live in, we always have to sort of tell people why they might be interested in hearing about us. So I hate doing this, but I will say it. I'm mostly known because I have won some awards. I've won the Hugo, the Nebula, and the World Fantasy Awards. My short story, The Paper Menagerie, is the first piece of fiction to have won all three of those awards in the same year. So if anyone knows me, that's probably why. I have several books out. One book that is very popular is called The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories. It's a collection of my short fiction. This came out a while ago. I have a second collection that came after that called The Hidden Girl and Other Stories. Besides those two collections of short stories, I also have a epic fantasy novel series called The Dandelion Dynasty. I think at least the first book, maybe even more, has been translated into German. And The Dandelion Dynasty is probably the work that I'm most excited about of my own work. It's an epic fantasy series that tackles the question of what does it mean to be modern, and how can we use technology as a way to think about what it means to be human. So it's epic fantasy, but it's written in a lot of ways like a science fiction series as well. And it's something that I put a lot of my heart into, and I'm really, really happy about it. And it's a series that really, in some ways, defined who I am as an author. And I invented a subgenre for it. It's called soap punk, which basically means that I wrote the novel. It's a fantasy novel, but the heroes of the novel are not wizards, but they're engineers. And their engineering language is based on the classical East Asian tropes of soak and bamboo and animal power and wind power and water power. And it's sort of my way of exploring how a technology vocabulary like that can allow us to think or rethink about modernity in a new way. So sorry, that was a little bit rambling, but I think that's a good picture of what I do overall. Oh, and also I should mention that I also had a past career as a software engineer and also as a corporate lawyer. And part of what I do now is I work as a futurist. So besides writing fiction, I'm also a futurist. And I consult with various organizations, mainly on the idea of how do we imagine the future and how do we tell stories about the future. So I think that's a pretty good intro of who I am.
And the first three books were translated from the Silpunk series. In German, it's Seidenpunk. And, Die Schwerter von Dara and stuff. I think the third one is only available as an ebook, and nobody yet has translated the fourth and the fifth. But sometimes we are just slow. So maybe there's hope.
It takes time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you say you're going in workshops to explore how to tell stories about the future. I would just go forward. How do we tell stories about the future? How do you get the nexus to start to tell a story about it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jamie. So let me tell you what these futurism conferences are like and what I usually do. So at a lot of these conferences, you have experts in various domains, and they come in and they try to speculate about how the future will be from their particular perspective. So someone who is working very deeply with AI, let's say, will imagine a future very much based around the concept of AI and the evolution of AI. Somebody who works in, say, renewable energies will try to portray a future very much centered around that. I think these are all great approaches. That's not what I do, however. I wouldn't consider myself a domain expert in that sense at all. So I wouldn't pretend to know, how to speculate about the future in that specific manner. The reason why I often attend these workshops is I have a particular view of how science fiction and how stories about the future influence the future or not, depending on your perspective. So because I work in the arts, right? So it's a fairly common thing. I don't know how common it is in Germany, but it is fairly common in the US for me to be asked in a very challenging way to justify my own existence. We're a very productivity-focused culture, right? So we're very focused on the idea that what you do must be of value, must contribute to capitalism in some sense. So the question is, what is the value of what you do? What do you do exactly, right? Like you make up stuff. What is the value you add, right? The arts have always had a hard time justifying themselves in a market economy, because if you look at the way we talk about the arts, it's really fascinating, right? We consciously or unconsciously, again, this is limited to the US, I'm not talking about Germany, consciously or unconsciously, I think we equate economic success with literary merit, or artistic merit in some sense has to be justified by whether people are willing to pay for it. So Ursula K. Le Guin, somebody I admire a lot, said that, even the business person who doesn't read books at all would once in a while read a bestseller, because the very fact that it's sold imply that there's a sort of magic to it, that it has value. If it has no value, why would so many people pay for it? So the fact that people pay for it means that it's valuable, which implies that the more people pay for it, the more valuable it is. And therefore, the most valuable stories necessarily have to be the stories that sell the most, right? That logic seems to be very straightforward in a capitalist society. And so this puts artists in a very difficult position, because if you know anything about the modern economy, you know that the arts are a very tiny part of the economy. We're almost nothing. I work in books, which is already nothing compared to the giant that is Hollywood. I mean, those of us who write books, most of us make very little money. Hollywood to us is like this huge magical kingdom full of money. But here's the thing. If you take all of the box office receipts of Hollywood, all of it, it doesn't even compare to the net revenue of just a single one of the trading banks on Wall Street. That's how tiny Hollywood is. Hollywood is a rounding error in the global scheme of financial engineering, right? So in our world, a banker will be more valuable than the entirety of Hollywood put together. And a single actor will be more valuable than just about all the authors put together. So that's where I am in the scheme of things, right? But that's not really how we think about things, is it? Right? I don't think most of us actually feel that way. But it does explain why I get asked the question of, what do you do? What is, why is what you do valuable? You make up stories and people don't even pay for it. But what are you doing that's so awesome? So faced with this kind of challenge, a lot of science fiction authors resort to justifying their existence in very instrumentalist ways. So they say things like, science fiction is a way to predict the future. So there's a lot of emphasis on the idea that science fiction authors are somehow prophets who can predict the future. And in that way, they're valuable. I really don't like that. And I'll tell you why. In the history of the genre, science fiction has almost never predicted anything in a precise way. They often have all kinds of, whenever they're trying to promote science fiction, they're like, oh, science fiction authors are so smart. They're prophets. They tell the future. And then you examine the actual, nature of these predictions. Not true at all. Science fiction authors are horrible at predicting the future. Horrible. The only instance where I can say a science fiction author has arguably predicted the future well is somebody like George Orwell. Orwell wrote something called, I know you're thinking I'm going to mention 1984, but I'm not. I'm actually mentioning Animal Farm. So Animal Farm is a little fairy story. It's obviously a fable about the Russian Revolution. But here's the thing, right? Orwell wrote it in 1943, 44, long before the advent of the communist revolutions in China, in Vietnam, and even in Korea. But if you look at the plot of Animal Farm and you compare to what happened in those places later on, it turns out to be an incredibly accurate prediction of every step that would happen in those revolutions. So, and these places have completely different cultures from Russia, right? So it's not a cultural thing. Something about the nature of these communist revolutions and something about human nature led these revolutions to follow the same route. It's incredible how accurate Orwell got everything right. So that's an instance where I think science fiction authors predicting the future actually can be credited as somewhat true. Orwell predicted the future path of those revolutionary regimes and their tyranny very accurately, far more than a lot of political commentators and economists and so-called smart people. So I do give Orwell a lot of credit for that. But other than that one instance of predicting the future of a social technology, I cannot think of many instances where science fiction authors were very good at predicting the future at all. So I don't agree with that. And I absolutely dislike the idea of predicting the future, of justifying what I do based on the nature of predicting the future. So that brings me back to the issue of why do I do what I do and how do I justify what I do? Well, it's not about predicting the future. I go back to Le Guin again, who had a lot of wise things to say on this. Le Guin said basically that artists are not cameras. We're not about reflecting reality back. So any artist who says, we just portray reality as it is, they're lying. That's nonsense. That's not what artists do. Artists are actually delving deep into the collective unconscious. And we are there to seek truth, not facts, not facts, but truth, right? We go into the collective unconscious and we retrieve symbols, these immersion symbols that allow us to think about things that we have no words for, right? Le Guin says artists are trying to bring forth what does not yet exist and what is felt, the truth that is felt, but not verbalized. And those of us who work in arts that are based around words are trying to say with words what cannot be said in words, which I think is so beautiful. And it makes sense because, this idea of trying to say with words what cannot be said in words, while it sounds paradoxical, is a very old part of Taoism. And Le Guin was a Taoist. Le Guin was well known as one of the few Western authors who actually took very serious interest in Taoism and who actually was very accomplished in Taoist philosophy. She herself was the author of a very excellent translation of the Tao Te Ching. And one of the oldest ideas in Taoism is this concept of language is insufficient to capture reality. And oftentimes we need to speak of the truth using words, even though words are not enough. We have to, what is beyond the words is more important than what is in the words. But okay, tangent, but going back to the original point, Jamie, that you were asking about, fiction and telling the future. Okay, so we're not really predicting the future. What we do is we delve into the collective unconscious and retrieve symbols that help us create and think about the future. So the best example of this is Mary Shelley, the mother of science fiction, if you will. She went into the collective unconscious and came back with Frankenstein's monster, right? That monster is a mythological figure that has been with us ever since. She delved into the collective unconscious and returned with Frankenstein's monster, which allowed us to talk about things that we don't have the words for. Think about the monster. Ever since she created him, he has been with us, and he's always there. He is as potent in our now collective imagination, in our collective unconscious, and in our mythology, modern mythology, as Apollo or Dionysus or Mercury or anyone you want to think about. Frankenstein's monster is somebody we invoke every time we're thinking about the impact of a new technology, every time we're thinking about artificial intelligence, every time we're thinking about robots, every time we're thinking about anything that is new, that is scary, that is something that we created but may come back against the creator. It's a potent mythological figure. And that's what science fiction authors do. We are not there to predict the future. We're there to delve into the collective unconscious and retrieve symbols to create mythologies that allow us to think about the future. So other mythologies that are important, Big Brother, Newspeak, Brave New World, Cyberpunk, these are all mythologies that are dug out of the collective unconscious, that are presented as symbols, that are able to articulate what cannot be said in words. That is what we do. And they become part of the future, not in a direct predictive way, but because they become part of our mythology. And our future is brought forth by our mythologies. Science fiction authors are really the modern mythologists. We are the mythologians. We are the ones who think about myth and story and deep truth. So, and people may or may not pay for us to do it. And that really isn't the point. So I know that's a very long-winded answer, but that's kind of how I think about what I do and how it relates to the future.
When you talk about truth, I think I have a leading question I thought about. That's the reason why I invited you, actually. I've already foreshadowed that to you earlier, but 4 years ago, a German translation of your story, Memories of My Mother, appeared in the German magazine Fantastisch. And it's a short story. It's really short, like 2 or 3 pages. And obviously, I was already interested in fantastic literature because I bought that magazine, but I wasn't yet a science fiction fan. But after these 3 pages, I was a science fiction fan. I was like, what? This is possible with science fiction as well? I thought it would all be about Star Trek or stuff. I don't know. And it's just, ever since I'm on the look for stories like that. Lucky me, I found other stories. And that's why I'm a science fiction fan now. I'm a late science fiction fan. I was already 40. So,
well, welcome to the club.
Yay!
Yeah, Dito.
I wasn't 11 like most of the science fiction fans. So, but the question I have ever since, as a reader and as an author and as a reviewer, how do you do that? That the story feels so real? Because it's obvious you couldn't have experienced this yourself, literally, because you're not an old woman whose mother was in space and has only visited you every couple of years on your birthday. And it's really obvious, so it's not literally. But I suspect that you have some kind of true emotion have put in there. I don't know. And I haven't only found that in that story, but also in other stories, which can't be true either. So there must be something you do, and I don't know what it is.
I think that's a great question, and unfortunately, I don't think I have a very satisfying answer, because I think all good, deep questions don't actually have simple, easy answers. I can only tell you what feels true to me from my own personal experience, and it's this. I think this is something that frustrates me a little bit about the way we think about modern art. or we think about art in modern times. So let me try to explain. So I think most readers or most listeners of your podcast will be familiar with the idea of the death of the author, which is, from Roland Barthes, the great French structuralist. And the death of the author is often actually misunderstood, right? So let me try to explain to you what I think it means and how it applies to the discussion here. Death of the author is this idea that it's a reaction against the prevailing system of literary interpretation at the time. So for a very long time in our Western history, I wouldn't say it's always been that way, but for a long time, interpretation of literary works has been sort of thought of as akin to interpretation of biblical verses, in the sense that when you're interpreting the Bible, the goal is to ascertain what God meant, right? The Bible is God's message to mankind. And so there is a absolute correct interpretation, which we're supposed to ascertain. God may bury the truth in a bunch of metaphors, but it's our job as humans to discern that true singular interpretation, the authoritative interpretation, right? So Song of Solomon, it's not really about a love song. It's really about the love between Christ and church, right? So that's an example of that kind of reading. And then literary critics and theoreticians apply that theory to the interpretation of literary texts. So the idea is, what does the author mean, really? We have to discern the true message that's buried inside a piece of literature. So in America, we often see this in bad English classes in middle school or high school, where, students are asked to discuss symbolism, right? So what does the letter A stand for? In Hester Prynne's shirt. What is the whale in Moby Dick? The whale must mean something. What is that something, right? So students are sort of treated as though reading a literary text is an act of cryptography. They're supposed to figure out the secret message, and if the secret message is correct, then they got it. If it's not, then they don't have it. Barthes was reacting against this theory of reading, and he's saying the author is dead, right? So all forms of interpretation where you go deep into the author's biography and you read their notes and you see what they said to their friends and you say, this is what they meant here. This is what they mean. This is what they're trying to say. And Barthes was saying this form of reading is very disrespectful. In truth, literary productions are a co-production of the reader and the author. And in fact, the author is already dead. The author is gone. All you have is the text. It's the reader who makes sense of the text. It's the reader who gives meaning to story. It's the reader who is the playful one, the real origin of meaning. It's the reader who goes in there and allows you to discern meaning from out of it. So if you have 100 different readers, you have 100 different readings, and they're all awesome. They're all good. So this is originally a very hopeful kind of vision for reading, and it's one that I often talk about in the introduction to The Hidden Girl and Other Stories. I actually talk about this. I say that specifically that literary productions are very interesting as artworks because it's done in language. We normally think of it as a communicative act because language is usually thought of as a communicative tool, meaning the whole point is to convey an idea accurately, a message accurately from this brain to that brain, right? Normally, you measure the success of a communicative act by whether the message is passed. So if you're giving directions, you've succeeded when the other person gets to where you told them to go, and you fail when they don't. But this model doesn't work for literary works, right? For works of art, novels, that's not how that works. You may have a situation where somebody is telling a story, and when I write a story, for example, I feel like I'm building a house, right? I have these particular understandings of how human nature works and how humans make sense of their own lives. But once I write the story, all that's there is just this empty house. The people are not in it. And readers are sort of like new inhabitants who move into the house that I built. the house I built obviously was shaped by a particular vision of human nature. But these different humans, the readers, move in and they have to fill the space with their own interpretive frameworks, their own emotional history, their own understanding of how human nature works, their own personal mythology, if you will. And then they make sense and build a new life in that house. But that life is theirs. It's not mine. This is a combination of what I've left on the page and their own interpretive faculties. So the death of the author originally is sort of this idea that the reader, that the joy of reading, the jouissance of reading, comes from that playfulness of not just trying to decipher the secret authoritative message, but to make your own message, right? I love that. I think it's very beautiful. But death of the author, has often had being misunderstood as the author just doesn't matter. The author is nothing to be thrown away. I don't think that's what Barthes meant either. So as applied to contemporary reading culture, there are two sort of reactions to the death of the author. One is this idea of all readings are equal, right? Which in some sense is true. But the problem with that is if you do readings that are deliberately hostile or you deliberately misinterpret the writer's intent and you deliberately find things to be angry about in the text that is not necessarily what the author meant, you end up with this endless cycle of outrage, right? We've all seen that. Somebody would read a piece of text and then deliberately gave it the most outrageous interpretation possible and then try to manufacture some sort of scandal out of it. And they'll say, well, the author doesn't matter. Intent doesn't matter. Only what I discern out of it matters. Yes, that is in some sense true, but also there can be a very bad faith way of applying that principle. So I think I see that sometimes. But the other reaction to me is also problematic, which is sometimes some readers react against the death of the author by saying that's all postmodernist nonsense. We're going to go back to the old way. We're going to go back to respecting the author. But what they mean in practice is they will interpret every author as merely autobiographical. They will delve deeply into an author's life and say, this is a novel about trauma. The author suffered trauma, so this is a novel about trauma. So even if the author says, I did not intend this to be that way, I meant to tell a universal story about human nature, some people will say, no. This book has to be understood only as something in relation to the author's life. It's sort of like interpreting every piece of art like a Taylor Swift song, right? People interpret Taylor Swift songs by saying, what is this about? This must be a coded message about some aspect of her life. It can't possibly be about anything else. So they apply that philosophy to interpretation of every single piece of artwork. So any novel has to be ultimately about the author's life in some sense. I think that's also very, very ridiculous and restrictive. So going back to your question, how do I do what I do, in the context of this? I think every author has to ultimately, in some sense, write what they know. You cannot delve into the collective unconscious unless you draw on your own experience of what it's like to be a human being, to live. All the emotions that you're describing ultimately are emotions that you have experienced or can imagine or can have seen in those around you. So ultimately, the emotional truth of what you write has to be based on your own lived experience. There's no question of that. Nobody is free from that. Shakespeare, Goethe, anybody who has tried to write something universal has to draw on that reserve of an actual personal lived experience. There's no question. This is why, Flaubert said, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. Like, you cannot possibly write about anything unless in some way it is in fact drawn from your own personal lived experience. But at the same time, we also are trying to dig out truth about the collective unconscious. And here we're aided by the fact that we're all human beings, right? So what that means is we share the same deep evolutionary history. We actually share so much of the same kind of experience in this universe that When somebody cries, we react to it. We can understand why they're sad. When somebody laughs, we can understand what that feels like. We ultimately are built the same. And so what Emma Bovary would suffer through, we can understand. That's the fundamental power of literature and really of any kind of art, really. It's the fact that we share the same evolutionary history, and we are pretty much built the same, and we have the same circuits, if you will. And so we suffer, we celebrate, we have the same kind of fundamental reference point for what it means to be alive and to be a consciousness in the universe. And that's why these uniquely personal emotions, one put into the form of a universal story, can have a universal effect. We do resonate with all of those emotions. And that's why reading stories is so powerful, because it affirms our commonality as human beings, this idea that we may feel like we're drowning alone, but we're not. All of us have done it. All of us are doing it, and all of us will continue to do it. We really are together in this deep, deep struggle against the inevitable triumph of entropy, and the universe may be cold and meaningless and all the rest of it, but we refuse to accept that, and that's true for all of us.
I would just like to add something to Yvonne's question, because I got the impression, that's a personal impression, that your text, you said something about resonating, and you left something on the page where I got my soul and ideas and my body into it and my brain. And I got the impression you have a skill to write your text on different levels. So you have one level where you address my cognition, where I just get the logic of the world and the story, what you share with me. And then you also have the ability to talk to my body, where my body does resonate to totally different cues, different words than my logical brain does. And this I found a really interesting reading experience, reading through some of your texts or short stories, where I just could not put my thumb on it. I hope that's also in English a proper term. It's a German proper term. How you use the different words to address these different levels from me, because my body needs different cues, different arrangements to resonate with something we label as that emotion or that. And my body needs different aspects to get an idea about the context you want me to feel and to get me to that resonating point, to this universal experience. Perhaps that's always the same. It's a similar pattern. I don't know. That would be interesting to have your opinion on. And the other thing is how you construct them to feel in such kind of harmony in your sentence that you can address both with these different aspects.
Oh my gosh. Wow. That's a great question. And I really like the way you frame that. I hadn't thought about it that way. But now I see it fits. So I don't know if there's something that I can reduce to words again. So this is very interesting, because you're bringing up a point that that may be actually relevant for one of my research interests, which is, AI produced art and whether that has a future or not. But anyway, so back to your question. So I was trained as a corporate lawyer, right? And I spent many years working as a software engineer too. So I'm very familiar with crafting artifacts out of symbols, whether it's legal briefs or a program, right? They're all very instrumentalist kind of artifacts. They have a specific purpose in mind. And I think fiction writing is actually very different from that. And that's what makes it so fascinating. When you're writing as a lawyer, for example, right, what you end up learning is the entire point of writing a legal brief, let's say, or a contract, is to narrow the field of possibility as much as possible. The entire point of writing a legal brief is to head off the judge and say, you may think this is acceptable, but it's not. You may think this is also acceptable, but it's not. The only conclusion you can come to is the one I am pointing you to. I am, it's like one of those Indiana Jones movies where everything's crumbling around you, and there's only one path you can follow, and it has to be the path you follow so you can get to the results I want you to get to. But when you're writing fiction, you realize that that model of linguistic field narrowing is terrible. Just that doesn't apply at all. I mean, this is again something that philosophers of language and literary theorists have been talking about since forever, so I won't belabor the point. But I think the whole point of fiction is to open up possibilities. So it's not a persuasive essay. If you're trying to write a persuasive essay when you're trying to create art, you're just completely wrong, right? So this is why somebody like Christopher Nolan has said that I never make movies about political causes I believe in, because he says it doesn't work. It doesn't actually work. If you're trying to create art, you can't put a propagandist message in it, because that's not what art is. Art is about opening up possibilities, not narrowing possibilities. And I think that's very true. When I'm trying to create a piece of fiction, I do think that I'm trying to open up possibilities. I'm trying to, in some way, capture the messiness of the human experience and the fundamental inarticulability of what it means to be human, to saying words what cannot be said in words. And that does require you to open up possibilities. In a lot of my stories, I sort of end up on the point where you're going to have to sort of make your own decisions to what happened. Like, the end of a story, is it a happy or a sad ending? Depends on your interpretation of what happens next. What do you imagine would happen next? And I think that's important. Fiction needs to leave the reader with that idea of potential possibilities. And it also means that when I'm writing, I think I have to do the best I can to make the reader feel rather than just think about what's happening. I think a lot of bad science fiction in the old days had a tendency to focus on what is happening rather than what is being felt, or what the human element of an experience actually is. And I think a lot of good science fiction, the kind of fiction that survives, ends up being very, very cognizant of the fact that it's not merely what happens that matters, but what the methodological interpretation, what we feel, what we experience, what our bodies think about. And I'm a big believer in, embodied cognition. So, I mean, I don't know if we have time to talk about this, but one of the topics I've been talking about quite a bit recently is the whole point of AI art. And I think one of the fundamental problems with AI art is that AI, as we have constructed it so far, is disembodied. They have no experience. And so a lot of AI art has a sterile, irreality to it, precisely because they don't have that embodied experience of what it means to be alive. And I'm simplifying somewhat, but I think that's a big part of it. When we experience a work of art, we do, in some sense, need, consciously or subconsciously, that feeling of bodily experience, because we don't just think with our brains, we think with our entire bodies. The old mind-brain dichotomy is not true. We are embodied cognition agents. Our emotions are not separable from our cognition. Our deep experience of what it means to be alive includes all of these faculties. And there's something about the way that stuff cannot be reduced to language. So even though human artists are trying to use language to evoke that which cannot be put into words, AI cannot. That is the way that I can think about it.
You also had a story in the digital aesthetes I bought, and I'm not through with the whole thing, but I've already read good stories where I think there's a lot of humor in it. Or I entered the house and I laughed. So
I love
and,
that. Yes.
And I also read Austin Horbershaw's story, The Laugh Machine. I don't know if you already read it, but there's also what you just said, because it's the narrator is a stand-up comedian, but AI. It's not a human being, and he just reproduces what the human beings have done before, but the human beings had relations from their true life, what they went through with their wives and stuff. They made humor of difficult situations in their marriage, and I can't do that. It just can't. And that's what the story is about. And Austin told me he really, really, really enjoyed your story. When I told him I read his story, he all of a sudden talked about your story, which I also read. So that's nice. So yeah, and that's really good, because good stories thinks it to the end, not only the process of writing the stories mostly via AI, and only due to legal reasons there are humans involved, and but in the end it's all about the consumption is also, well, there's AI involved. Yes, it's fun, but I can imagine that it's not all funny about this new technology, and many people are very concerned about it.
Yeah, it's a difficult time. It's a hard topic. I don't know. I mean, if you have the time, I'll delve into a little bit, because this is a topic I've thought about a lot, and there are interesting things that I think I can say about it. So, do we have time?
If it's okay for Jamie.
Okay.
Yeah, fine.
So in terms of AI and art, my view on this is a little bit different from how a lot of people think about it. I don't, I obviously don't subscribe to the Silicon Valley's techno utopianism, which is actually very anti-human, right? There's a strain of thinking in Silicon Valley where some people are actually gleeful about the potential of machines completely replacing human artists. They're actually very happy about it, because in their view, human artists are, again, producers. So how do you measure whether producers are doing a good job or not? Well, by whether consumers actually buy their stuff. Are they pleasing their consumers? So the theory, right, in Silicon Valley, the theory has always been companies that don't make what users want won't survive. This is just the basic logic of capitalism. If you want to survive, you have to sell, and people will only buy things that they like, that they enjoy. So the question is, are artists doing what they're supposed to do? Well, according to the logic of capitalism, very poorly. Actually, artists are really bad at their jobs. The vast majority of novelists sell very few copies, right? Only a few are bestsellers. The vast majority of books, period, sell very few copies. And the books that do sell a lot are, the memoir by Prince Harry, right? That sells a lot of copies. And so by that measure, I suppose Prince Harry would be considered the best artist. So you may agree with that. So, and even movies, right? Plenty of movies are flops. So according to Silicon Valley logic, this means that human artists are actually very bad at their jobs. They're not producing stuff that's really what consumers want. So if you view that as the problem, and machines ultimately produce things that are bestsellers, and people will buy machine-produced work, then good riddance to the human artists, because the human artists are not producing what consumers want. If consumers are willing to buy stuff produced by machines, then, it's great. So according to this logic, for example, right, why are so many romance writers insistent on writing something new when their readers want to read the same thing over and over again? So a machine might be very happy to write the same thing over and over again, and with the smallest amount of variability. And if humans end up enjoying reading that, and human authors are put out of work, then who do they have to blame but themselves? Because, art is about production. I think this is a fundamentally flawed view of what art is about. My view is we support the arts via commerce as a compromise, not because that is the point of art. The point of creating art is not to sell more copies. And if you don't agree with that statement, then, we're never going to agree on any of the rest of it. So the Silicon Valley view of AI replacing humans being a good thing is, to me, fundamentally flawed, because it doesn't actually understand what the point of art is. At the same time, I'm not anti-AI in the sense of a lot of writers are. A lot of writers think that AI is just a horrible thing and it should never have been invented and all the rest of it. And I don't agree with that either. So the way I think about it is, I go back to the analogy of traditional instances where human craft has been displaced by machines and what that actually meant. And a very good example that I can use as a historical analog to the current moment is the invention of photography back in 1839. I mean, that's a controversial statement already because, as it turns out, I study a lot about the history of technology because I'm a technologist, and I spent many years in the litigation industry as an expert witness on technology issues. So I know a lot about the history of innovation. Even photography's own invention was very complicated, and we sort of have this idea of the daguerreotype as the first commercially successful form of photography, and was invented in 1839, which is all untrue, but let's just go with it as the conventional story, right? So as soon as 1839 happened, there was a huge reaction all across Europe and America, and then in the rest of the world, to this new invention. Because, think about it, artists are supposed to represent nature. And now you have a machine that can use light and chemistry to represent nature, and often in a way that feels, quote unquote, better than humans. So if your belief is that the point of art is to represent nature accurately, then the camera will displace our artists, right? So that's why, the French literary establishment and artistic establishment reacted particularly strongly against photography. I mean, Baudelaire had this very famous quote about how the invention of photography is the worst thing that ever happened to French art. This machine will destroy French art, very hyperbolic statements, and artists were terrified, our human craft will be debased by this horrible machine. What actually happened? What actually happened is four things. Number one, artists learned that the camera actually can be their friend because, as a painter, if you sold your painting, you don't have it anymore. But with photography, you can now have a reproduction of your painting. In fact, you can actually make your own prints and sell reproductions, as Winslow Homer did. And this was incredible because it led to a revolution in Western thinking. Prior to the invention of photography, an image was just the original in which it was embodied. The Mona Lisa was the Mona Lisa. That was it. There's no abstraction from that. An artwork is embodied in the work. But after photography, the image and the embodiment became separate things. You could have reproductions. Like when we think about the Mona Lisa, we think of this abstract thing that can be embodied in that original in the Louvre, but also in, my wallet. I mean, it can be everywhere. Like by the invention of this idea of the image as a reproducible, separable thing from the original, completely revolutionary. So that's one thing that happened. The second thing that happened is artists learned to use the camera as an aid in their own work. And so this is where, you have these books of photography that feature models in distant places, and artists would use them as studies to paint what they do. And also, as you know, artists like Degas would use photographs of dancers and horses as the sort of the models from which they did their sculptures and paintings. And that's really cool too. The third thing that happened was photography allowed artists to see things they could not see before, which is incredible, right? So for example, right, in Western art, because the human eye can't capture how horses move, we have all of these paintings of horses doing things like this. They extend their legs front and back, looking really awkward. Like you see that a lot in the 18th century and 17th century. But starting with the late 19th century, especially after the Muybridge studies, motion studies at Stanford, where, they took the camera and captured still frames of a horse galloping. For the first time, we now know how a horse actually runs. Like we couldn't see that before. So now people painted horses differently. So the camera, like the microscope or the telescope, allowed us to see reality in a different way, and artists could portray those things differently. So we could see reality in a new way. So the Muybridge studies allowed artists to see how horses actually ran. And, like the microscope, like the telescope, the camera allowed human artists to see the world in an entirely new way, and they could portray it. But none of this matches the biggest impact of the camera on the arts, which is the invention of entirely new forms of art that could not have been possible without the camera. So photography being the most prominent one. Photography itself became a form of art and influenced the other arts. You could argue Impressionism and Abstractionism, all of these other forms of art were a reaction against photorealism. Photography portrayed things in a certain way, and all the arts had to react to it. But even more significantly, you have cinema, you have TV, you have YouTube. All of these new forms of art, of storytelling using the camera, were invented after the camera into being. Like the camera allowed dramatic arts to experience an entirely new evolution. Without the camera, you couldn't have all the new ways that we tell stories now. Cinema is incredible, right? Because unlike traditional drama, which has to follow the Aristotelian unities of action, time, and place, cinema broke all of that up. You could have montages, you could have flashbacks, you could have reaction shots, you could have all sorts of things that we've learned to decode as cinema viewers. But they're revolutionary ways of telling a story that could not be possible without the camera. So, what does this have to do with AI? I think all of these cases are applicable to AI. AI will allow artists to expand and reproduce themselves in a way that was not possible before. AI will allow artists to do their job better. You know, as a novelist, I can imagine having AI as a beta reader can be incredibly helpful, helping me find places where I miss things, or telling me linguistic issues about my work that I wouldn't have picked up on my own. AI can reveal aspects of reality that we are now just coming into just reckoning with. You know, how does it work? What does it mean? How does language work? There are all kinds of interesting things we're now using AI to reveal about ourselves that will change art. And finally, AI as a tool will enable entirely new forms of art, new forms of storytelling, new forms of adaptation that I can't even imagine. I mean, in the same way that if you just look at the very first daguerreotype, you can't possibly imagine all the movies that will come afterwards. We can't possibly look at AI right now and imagine all the new forms of storytelling that will come into being enabled by AI. So I'm incredibly hopeful about what AI as a tool will allow humans to do. But having said all of that, I do also want to mention one other thing, which is that some artists did in fact lose their jobs because of the camera, and they're not necessarily the people you think. So some artists did in fact lose their jobs and lose their livelihoods to the camera. And it's interesting to see exactly who, right? The largest class of artists who actually lost their jobs to the camera are not the people you think of. They're not the painters, the portraitists, or any of the people that we normally think of when we think about artists. The profession that was basically destroyed by photography was engraving. And so I have to sort of explain what engraving was about. So again, prior to the invention of photography, when you wanted to have an image reproduced, there was no way to mechanically do it. You had to actually have another artist, an engraver, translate the original painting into essentially a carving that can then be used for printing. So engravers were very skilled artists on their own, and they were essentially interpreters. They had to interpret your original painting into the language of lines and cuttings into this new medium so that it can be used for reproductions. And they did their own job, right? Engravers did their own job. They were artists on their own. But once photography became possible, there were all these new ways of doing photomechanical reproductions that essentially made engraving obsolete. So you have photolithography, which is the idea that you have a lithographic plate, you coat it in some sort of photoresist that will react to light, and then you project a photographic image of the image you want onto that photoresist. So the parts that are exposed to light will become hardened, and then you wash away the part that's not exposed using acid. So now you end up with a photomechanically produced engraving that you can use for printing, which meant that you no longer needed engravers. Now you might say, well, engravers were artists, so they had to do interpretation. Yes, that's correct. They did. They had to do interpretation. And that human element is removed when you do photomechanical reproduction. But it turns out that artists actually prefer things that way, because when you're talking to your audience through an interpreter, that always feels like You don't have the control. But if you're using a photomechanical reproduction method, you now have control. You're no longer at the whim of the interpreter, right? The interpreter may decide to simplify the lines or change some compositional element, and you don't like that. But with a camera, there's nothing like that. You can tweak a few knobs, but the ultimate result is much more in your control as an original artist. So my conclusion from this is any art form whose highest ideal is the reproduction of some original is most at threat for being replaced by machines. So if you apply that principle to today, you can sort of predict which art forms, which artists are most at risk. So for example, commercial artists who work in graphic design, whose entire art, the highest ideal is whether they successfully executed the vision of the client. I think that is one of those professions that's going to be at risk because clients are not paying you necessarily. Many clients, anyway, are not necessarily paying you for your ability to do original execution. They're paying you to execute their vision. And it's much easier to iterate with a machine that will never complain, that will never tell you that you're wrong, than it is to work with human graphic designers. I'm not saying that there will not be clients who realize the value of human interpretation and human invention and say, I'm willing to pay for that. But there will be a substantial number of clients who will not, who will say, I'd rather do it with the machine because I just want the machine to do what I want. Similarly, if you view some art form, say acting, if you view acting as a profession whose highest ideal is to replicate the original that's in the director's head, like the director has a vision for how a character should be, and it's the job of the actor to execute that vision. If you think that's what acting is about, I think actors are in trouble. But on the other hand, if your view is actors are original artists who collaborate with the director to create a character, they are not mere copyists. They don't just copy whatever the vision is in the director. They actually invent this character. And then they're safe. I feel like in that case, then they're safe. So a lot of this stuff is based on what do we think about an art? Do we think an art form is about executing some other vision to reproduce faithfully the vision of some other artist? Or do we think it's about something more, something different? Obviously, all these words I'm using are contentious and they're open to interpretation, but I think it's a good framework to think about the impact of AI on the arts. I think like any other kind of mechanistic revolution, originality is going to be rewarded. So to the extent and to the degree that your art is about originality, an originality that you actually find valuable in your own artistic way, and perhaps the market finds valuable, although that's a secondary issue, then it will not be threatened by AI. But otherwise, it might be. So anyway, that's a long answer, but I think I hopefully that was actually kind of interesting.
I think we aren't even off topic because maybe AI might be on the long run an advantage because I really detest all these not really original science fiction which could have been written 70 years ago, and some naked woman has to be rescued by a strong man from the alien. I don't know. That's only the most cliche I could think of. And maybe we have better prose then. Or maybe what's left is then better.
Yvonne, you're absolutely right. I think that's very possible. I mean, some people have said that in the same way that photography pushed a lot of bad art out of way, right? There used to be places and instances where an artist would be hired to do something, and we don't do that anymore because the way humans execute those things was bad art. Like humans used to be hired to do sketches of current events to illustrate newspapers. And we realize that's a bad use of human ingenuity. Like machines can do a better job. So humans are not needed for that job anymore. So similarly for what you're talking about here, maybe what I call C+ romances. There are some readers who want C+ romances, meaning they need to fulfill a certain formula. They need to do the right thing. Like by page 50, there has to be this moment. By page 25, you need to meet cute. Like, it's a very formulaic thing. Maybe machines can execute that better because humans are bored with it. And so maybe humans can be pushed in new directions in the same way that artists were pushed in new directions as a result of photography. Although, Yvonne, I do have to mention that I also am sympathetic to the fact that a lot of artists have made their living this way. I don't mean to dismiss their concerns. The idea that, like, those graphic designers I'm talking about, they made their living that way. And it's a horrible thing to think that they're being displaced. Writers who made a living writing cookie cutter romances or what have you, they're real human beings too. And if they're being displaced, that is not merely an economic event. It's also, a real human beings being affected here. So I don't know, I don't know what the right answer there is, but I think in terms of overall trends in art, I think you're right. I think it's very possible that, in fact, we may actually end up pushing human ingenuity in better directions because human originality will be rewarded for the things that they do well, whereas a lot of the things they're not good at, maybe machines can do.
I would like to give it a bit of a turn because as I listened to your explanations or ideas, I was just wondering, could AI resonate with our bodies? Because I think that was you have it, you stretched it in a lateral way, but I just want to have it explicitly as one thing. Because I think, how would you program it to feel and to put the right words that we can resonate? But that's just a comment. I just want to go a bit like you say. You're talking about originality would be valued or would be praised, and this, if I understand you right, this originality has to do with the author's process to dig deep into the collective unconscious, yes. And this is an individual process. This is a human process, which couldn't be, or perhaps it could be copied by AI programs. We don't know yet. They would try to do it. If they can do it, they could do originally art. And I just asked, how do you do the deconstruction, or how you dig some values, and you said in some interviews or in an essay, you said you have these values in your stories, which is a cure aspect, and then you put some deconstruction on it, which I have the impression you have these values which resonate with you, and which is also a kind of the universal experience. And then you put some of your experience on that, and then you deconstruct this kind of experience so that we got an impression that you tell us something about your real life, but in fact you don't. And how far are you stretching that deconstruction?
Yeah. Okay. So let me start by going back to this whole AI thing, and then I'll talk about this idea too. In terms of the AI stuff, I'm a materialist, so I do believe that, if we can somehow understand the material pathways, the principles by which we have consciousness and all the rest of it, there's no reason why it cannot be mechanically evoked or produced. There's nothing. I don't believe there's some sort of mythical thing that cannot be found in material. Okay, so we can ultimately reproduce artificial intelligence if we figure out how to evoke consciousness and all the rest of it. And if we get to that point, I don't see why AI art wouldn't be just as interesting as human art. In fact, my concern at that point would be whether we can even understand it. I mean, presumably, if the AI is constructed of a different material substrate and it has a different experience of the universe and it has just a different evolutionary history than ours, even though it shares some of it because, we would be creating the AI. It's hard for me to know if we will be able to even understand them in the same way that humans have trouble understanding whales or elephants or plants for that matter. We don't really understand any of them. So what makes us think that we'll understand AI any better? But I would be willing to try. I mean, if a toaster one day is sufficiently AI advanced and conscious to be able to write a novel or whatever the equivalent of a novel would be, I would be incredibly curious to read it. I hope I can understand it, because to understand how a toaster experiences universe would be just as interesting as understanding how a whale experiences universe. I would be very, very interested. Okay, having said all of that, let's go back to what you asked about the value. So I think we humans narrate our own lives into being, right? I mean, Dickens was, I think, the first author to write explicitly about this, but I think it's a very common idea, which is we humans don't really make sense of the world by data. We make sense of the world through mythology, through stories. So, we're all born into the world naked, ignorant, and like the epic heroes of old, Adam constructed out of clay. And into that garden, if you will, come our first angels and demons. They're our caretakers. The way they love us becomes the way we think about love, and the way they hurt us becomes the way we think about trauma. And they become our first stories, our mythologies. They are the foundational stories with which we make sense of everything else that comes after. And as we grow up, we acquire more stories. A friend sticks up for us on the playground, and now we understand courage. A parent acts contrary to what he says he would do, and now we understand hypocrisy. All of these things are foundational stories that we acquire as we grow. So friends, foes, lovers, they all leave us with scars and myth that we then shroud ourselves with as we grow up and grow older. And someday, halfway through life's dark woods, like Dante, we see that we are not just the recipients of stories. We are now, in fact, the guides and the heroes and demons of the stories of those who come after us. The way we treat them may be a small moment, but it becomes a foundational mythology for them. The moment we speak to our child harshly becomes a core memory for them that they will have forever. The moment we stand up for our principles and illustrates that it is possible to be brave and to do the right thing will become a core memory for them as well, for their understanding of what it means to be brave, to be just, to be a free human being. That's how culture is passed on. We see these stories acted out before us, and then we embody them for those who come after us. That's literally the only point of culture. It's to enact the stories, the values that we care about, and in the hopes that they will now become the mythologies for the next generation. And so I say, this is true for not just individuals, but entire nations. I was trained as a lawyer, and so I think a lot about constitutions. That was actually one of the things that I study very deeply, constitutions in different countries. And a lot of times, people criticize the United States for having a very bad constitution. And I think it's a bad criticism because it misunderstands what a constitution is. A constitution is not just a document. It's actually a set of mythologies, of stories that people collectively believe in about what makes them who they are and why they are the way they are. The UK does not even have a written constitution. It really is just a set of precedents and stories and mythologies, literally. The UK has one of the world's oldest constitutions, and it has been extremely effective, I would say. And the US is the same way. If you read the document, it's full of blank spaces and all these terrible things that don't make any sense. And the reason we've been able to make it work is because we have a bunch of shared stories. I tell people always that good stories are much more important than good institutions, because when institutions fail, good stories will allow you to route around them and patch things up. But when stories are bad, the best institutions in the world will do nothing. It will do nothing. That's why you have so many countries with wonderful constitutions written by Harvard lawyers, and they're mired in political violence and dysfunction because a good piece of paper doesn't do anything if there are no stories to support it. The stories, the unwritten constitution is so much more important than the written one. Anyway, all of that is to say that because we individuals live these mythological lives, that we make sense of who we are through these individual stories, the mythologies of different people will resonate with us because even though they are all specific, uniquely tied to their own experience, they are still fundamentally shared by human experience. So when I, imagine something, the emotional content and how people feel is informed by my own personal mythology. But the situations, the conditions, the reactions, the way people behave, I believe those are extracted from the truth of human nature. And so if I do my job well, other readers will read it and be able to apply their own personal mythology to it and emerge with an understanding that is not identical to mine, but will resonate. That's what it means to resonate. We're not the same, but we vibrate in some sense to this shared experience of what it means to be human.
So the construction might be to hold or describe characters' action in an abstract way, which many people can have a different resonate impact or resonate.
I wouldn't necessarily say that way. Jamie, the reason why that's difficult is, I teach writing. I actually teach writing. And this is a question I have to sort of deal with my students a lot. And I always say that a lot of this stuff is not stuff that can be reduced to rules and to verbal formulation, because a lot of it is how it feels rather than how it is worded. I can say that, the way to write a moving scene is to get into the characters' heads. But what does that mean? Like, that's just a verbal formula that doesn't actually tell you anything. You actually have to feel it to do it, to understand how it works, which is why writing, like a lot of, art work, requires you to practice, because you really have to teach yourself how that works. You have to evaluate your own experience to a work of art and then see how to do it. Why is it that when we use a particular extended metaphor, we can get the readers to feel that way? Is it because we've been trained through epic poetry to understand extended metaphors that way? Or is it because something about the way our brains work through analogies that these things work? What makes a particular metaphor effective? And if you push poets or writers on this, ultimately they end up with, I don't know. It just works. And the fact is, everybody has to invent their own way of doing it. That's the other thing, right? There's no formula, because I can't even describe what I do. It's sort of like asking a fish, how do you swim? The fish does blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't know. The fish just does it. That's how writers are. Asking a writer how they do what they do is like asking a fish, how do they swim? They don't know. They just do it. And in the same way that every fish swims slightly differently, I think every writer also does it slightly differently. Every writer who is worth reading, at least, must invent their own language to do what they do, because every writer sees the world slightly differently. They have a unique perspective on the universe, and it's that uniqueness that draws us, right? I mean, I talked about the sharedness, the resonance that we care about, but that's not the only thing we care about. We also care about the fact that it is actually a different consciousness who sees the world in a slightly different way. The red that they see is slightly different from the red that we see, and that difference is interesting to us too. We don't just yearn for the resonance of we're all drowning together and we're all human. We also yearn for the fact that, holy moly, like, there's a new way of seeing the world. Like, this is somebody else who actually see things just differently. That's actually really neat. In order to do that, the writer has to invent their own language, which is why they sound different, right? I mean, you read Milton, he didn't write in some sort of early modern English, generic early modern English. He wrote in Miltonese, if you will. It's Milton's own language, and his English is not like anybody else's from that time. Melville is the same. Melvillian, right, is a completely different language than so-called 19th century American English. Every writer has to do that. Every writer that you actually care about reading will end up having to invent their own language and their own way of doing the things that we're talking about.
We have one really important question left, Jamie, we really wanted to ask. Because in more recent interviews, you told the audience that you're now finished the Silkpunk series and you now have a new book project. And we were wondering if you are allowed to tell us something about it.
I can talk about it generically. It's still a secret, and so there's not. I can't reveal details. I will say this:
nobody listened to this, so you can be open.
I will tell you what I can say, which is I'm working on a new novel. It's my first new novel after the Dandelion Dynasty series. I'm super excited about it. What is it about? Well, it's different. It's a sci-fi novel, obviously, but it's sci-fi novel as written by me. I mean, in the same way that the Dandelion Dynasty doesn't really feel like a typical epic fantasy, this doesn't feel like a typical sci-fi novel either. But it's about all the things that I'm excited about, the things that we've been talking about, which is art, AI, consciousness. What does it mean to tell stories? What does it mean to live in a world where there are cameras everywhere and everything is recorded? Is that actually just really a terrible thing, or is that really maybe there are actually new opportunities for freedom being presented? So without giving away anything, I can say that this is the first novel, hopefully in a new series, that I'm super excited about. And I again, because I'm interested in so many things here, there's no secret message. There's no single message. I'm going to write the thing that I'm obsessed with and all the complicated messiness of this experience, and let readers take away from it what they can. Hopefully the stuff I'm interested in are things that the things I'm interested in are things that readers are also interested in, and hopefully readers will then resonate with what I end up writing, and feel a lot of joy in it. So I can say that I'm having a lot of fun doing it. It's very exciting. I'm in that stage where I'm drafting, and I hate drafting. So if I'm excited about drafting, that's already a good sign.
Is there any kind of publication date we can look forward to, or is it that it's still secret?
So because I'm still drafting, I don't think I have a specific date in mind. I mean, we'll have to see what the publishers say and what ends up happening. But I can say that that's one thing about publishing that I've learned, which is things are always going to take longer than you expect, and it's slower than you expect. I'm turning manuscripts, and then it doesn't even come out until 4 years later. So I hope that's not the case here. I hope it's much faster than that. But publishing can be very, very slow sometimes.
We will look forward to read it. Sounds really interesting.
Thank you.
Cool.
I'm super excited about it.
Highly recommended to read.
Right.
Now it would be perfect to just go to the next bar and have some beer, but I think it's too early for you.
A little bit early for me, but thank you. If I ever visit Germany, though, that's what I would do. Yeah, well, thank you, Jamie and Yvonne. This has been a really fun conversation. Thank you very much for having me be part of it.
Thank you for these really interesting insights in these different directions. I really liked how you also shaped always the context and get to nail the point at the end. That was really interesting to see both different ways and get together in there.
Without notes, maybe.
Yeah, without notes.
Yeah.
I've taken notes.
Me too.
But I will have time to take notes while cutting. Yeah, thank you. I will let you know when everything is done, which might be next week. Yeah, have a nice day. And I just pressed the stop button. Goodbye.
Yes. Sure. Have a great evening.